Hello, everyone. My name is Manuel Montoya, and I am a member of the Terra Prime team. Very excited to have Dr. Reilly White, a good personal friend of mine, and a very wonderful member of the community. He's a professor of finance in the FI department in the Anderson School of Management, and he is also just an all-around awesome human being. And as a debt of gratitude, he has just purchased a classroom pack from terraprime.com. Thank you very much, Reilly, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Manuel. It's an honor to be here. It is an honor to use this product. And thank you all to the viewers here for walking through an educational process with me about how to best use this deck.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. This is going to be a fairly informal conversation that we're going to have using the Terra Prime deck. The whole point of it is for us to get acquainted with how the decks can be used. I know that you're going to be using them in the classroom, and so we're just going to go back and forth, talk a little bit about your initial reaction with the cards, and then we'll go through a little bit of the three modes that the handbook talks about so that people can get used to using the cards. Once again, please check our YouTube channel and subscribe and like the YouTube channel for Terra Prime. We're going to be posting regular sessions. We'll have Terra Prime sessions, which are going to be very topical, where we use the cards for a specific conversation and topic, or we'll be doing how-to guides like this one, which is going to be a combination of a conversation that Reilly and I are going to have, plus just some kind of meta discussions about how the decks can be used in the classroom, at the dinner table, in the boardroom, or wherever you're going to be using them. So once again, please make sure that you support the Terra Prime decks by buying the Blueprint deck. Very excited. We have our first production run done, and the Blueprint deck is really our starter pack. It's an affordable pack that can be used in different modes. It's a nice quality stock, and it's intended to also serve as a revenue generator for other projects that we're going to be doing. So Reilly and I have been talking a little bit about other future projects that the Terra Prime team is going to be doing, including the Artisan deck, which is a deck with all original art, and also in the future even other products like a children's deck. So Reilly, please share with us your initial reaction about the Terra Prime deck and how you got acquainted with the deck as it was being developed.
Of course. Thank you so much, Manuel. So this has been a project that you have kept me aware of, in the loop of, for quite some time. I had a chance early in the production process to get a glimpse of some of the cards as they were kind of being processed in a digital way. I am struck by how thorough this is, how beautiful the cards are. And when I purchase these things, like the artwork, the level of quality is just, it blows my mind. But also the subject matter that itself is remarkably thorough, but involving topical discussions in ways that, like, I have never grappled with or never seen applied in a systematic way in conversations before. So in looking at this and sort of reacting with this, I mean, the card quality is very durable. Anyone who knows me knows I drop I will be I'm clumsier than the average bear. And in each of these things, nonetheless, all of my decks have survived. I spilled coffee on one, I wiped it off. I can speak to its high dexterity and quality. I was just genuinely impressed at the quality, the scope, and the level of detail in these cards. And you read them, you get a sense of, in each subject matter, it tells you, it has questions to think about, ways to operate discussion in ways where I myself lack the language to describe. So this has been a really remarkable thing. So I'm very pleased with them.
Thanks so much. And he's not being paid to do this, so this is really awesome. He's actually he's a paying customer, so very fired up about that. I'm excited for you to use the deck in the classroom and in other contexts, but today is basically a way to give a window to people who are learning about the deck, how the deck can be used. And so we're going to go through a couple of different different ways that the deck works. I'm going to scroll through. We have a digital copy on the screen here, but Reilly and I both have our own individual decks in our hands here, which is really the main point, is having the decks in your hands is really part of the experience. You can do this stuff digitally, and that's fantastic, but really having the decks in your hands gives you a way to have a physical connection to some of the concepts that are in the deck. So I'm going to scroll through a couple of the cards. Before I do that, I just want to show the card that describes the anatomy of each card. So every deck contains 30 cards. We have the cover card, which gives you a link to the website, and there is a little code on the bottom, a QR code that you can scan, and it'll take you to terra-prime.com. And there you can download a copy of the handbook for free, and you can learn a little bit more about where the images come from, what the process was, and also learn how to get started with several of the things that we're going to get started with today, including what we're going to call roundtable mode. It's a very simple process, and the cards were designed to be almost self-descriptive in the sense that the front of each card contains an artistic image, and we have 28 themes in the cards. The card will be enumerated, so cards 1 through 28 will be put front and forward in the center. There you can see at the bottom there's a theme that reminds you of the central idea of the card, and then there's other prompts that we can get into in just a little bit when you want to get a little bit more I guess complicated with the way that the cards can work. But at its most simple, you look at the image, and I actually just yesterday did on Tuesday did a session with Rob's Innovation Academy group that came in from Japan, and the language barrier I thought was going to be an issue, but it actually wasn't. It was beautiful, and in fact, they got really excited that I had a kawaii and a kaiju card, and we got all of the students. I believe there was about 14 students there from different parts of Japan, some students from Vietnam, and every student talked about culture shock. So the main point of the cards, we pick a theme or a topic of their choosing, and we did what was called roundtable mode. Everybody got a chance to look at the cards, and they picked their favorite card. And the very basic premise was they would just talk about how the card got them to think about an aspect of culture shock in a different way. And there were some really profoundly beautiful things that were said. And despite us having a translator and having a language barrier, a lot of really wonderful things were being said about the journey that these students made from Japan to come over to Albuquerque to work with us. The back of the card can get you more complex. And in fact, my recommendation in the classroom is that whenever you draw a card, one of the great things about roundtable mode is that everybody gets a chance to say something, and you can do it within a limited time frame if you need to. So everybody has about 2-3 minutes to give an initial reflection or reaction to a topic of importance in the classroom. And in order to get people started, it's often useful to read the prompt in the back of the card, the very first part. And that one gets you thinking about the card's content, but if you want to go deeper, there are questions to move you along with the card's theme, some keywords that some people may or may not know about. A lot of people don't know what a commodity fetish is, for example, in card 25, or they may not be familiar with something like trauma theory or the word mimesis. But those are words that are connected or that have been part of the intellectual tradition that inspires each particular card. You can use them if you want, but like the group from Japan, they basically use the images, and they had 3 or 4 minutes to translate the cards using some of their software or talking to the translator that was present, and it was actually a great success. So I'm very confident that any community and any context could use these cards to varying degrees of sophistication. So what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to ask Reilly to point out, is there a card that you are drawn to these days, given that you've had a chance to look at the deck? And we'll go through that card just to describe how the card works and how you've interpreted that card.
That's a very good question. I love that question. And also, to speak of the durability of cards, they fit neatly behind your ears as well. One of the things one thing that struck me when I looked at this card, and particularly because I work in this realm of numerical quantification and sort of quantifiable data, was the Grand Abacus card, actually, and that's card 7 in the card deck. And what I loved about this was the idea, especially as we focus, so much of my life revolves around the question of creating certainty around numerical quantities. But there's also sort of the idea that here, underneath those numerical quantities, there lies real human interaction in human interface that often is overlooked. You know, how can one really quantify a human life or a demographic quantity or the value of an idea or principle within those ideas? And so I'm always personally fascinated by the Grand Abacus card, which is
Awesome. Thank you. And it fits excellent in a hat, especially if you have a nice hat band.
a top hat, maybe, or
A top hat would be perfect and ideal.
it's neatly inside of a goblet. It's very pleasant.
I love it. Yeah, it's good for dinner, and it's also good for chewing on, like quite physically. You can chew on it, and I don't know how durable it'll last, but you know, it's got bicycle quality, so you can even put it on a bicycle wheel, make lots of noises, put it on your electric vehicle. Let's see if it makes any noises. Oh, nice pocket protector. Lots of functions for the Terra Prime deck. If you were to use this card in the classroom, one of the things that I would recommend is that you get the student to either read aloud or to themselves the very first part. You get everybody to just reflect on that. The first vignette says, "You may have heard the term, quote unquote, you're just a number. How about the adage, quote, one life lost is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Since the birth of demography, we find ourselves constantly reckoning with how we count in this crazy, complex world. Use this card to think about the many ways counting lives affects the way we think about a problem, especially when a topic has a problem measuring people or other living things." And so that gets the tone started, and we can use this for any number of things. I love the Grand Abacus card for a lot of the reasons that Reilly has indicated, but it also makes me reflect. In my classroom, I've used it to talk about international management issues. And one of the things that I always ask my students is how many people died during World War II? And, you know, that turns into a bigger discussion about the varying numbers that are out there, right? Some people will say 45 million. Some people will say 70 to 80 million. And you know, when you think about something like a death toll, when you give or take 10 million people, you're dealing with you then have to open up a Pandora's box of what happens when the numbers are that different. And I asked my students, I said, look, as a problem, I mean, the one of the most compelling and probably troublesome things that we take for granted is who counted? How did the count actually happen? You know, are you talking to soldiers? Are you talking to governments, census bureaus, community leaders, hospitals? And you're not just taking count of people on any one side of a battle. You're talking now coordinating with people who may have been your enemy, and trying to think through how you actually authenticate a count like this, and dealing with all the politics of that. So I really love this card as well. I think this is a really, really cool card. And it's one that can be applied to a bunch of different things and opens up a bunch of possibilities for how we think about problems. I want to ask you, as we go through this, because you are a really, really wonderful teacher in lots of aspects. You talk a lot about inclusivity in your work in the community when it comes to finance and to financial inclusion. What kind of topic, just spitballing right off the bat, what kind of topic, either professionally or otherwise, would you like to use as the topic that we're going to discuss for the next 10 or 15 minutes?
That's a great question. So when I think about, you know, the one that stands out to me, and I think with this role in particular, and particularly within the dimensions you just described, I would look at sort of, and relevant here, and sort of, I am a professor in New Mexico, so obviously a forerunner element of policy this year was sort of the legalization of marijuana in our state, which happened in April of this year. And the interesting part of that topical discussion is the calculus behind that is highly variable. So you have people who were in opposition to it, you have people that were for it. We have people, at the same time thinking of inclusivity, looking at the people who are imprisoned in various capacities for drug-related offenses. You also have, say, a benefit of the consumption of cannabis that is described in healthcare and other facilities. And not being an expert in that level, it is interesting. But also, then you also have additional costs potentially with any legalization. And what are those costs look like? And we term that question always in terms of human lives and relativity. So we always say, for instance, that we can save this many people who are currently imprisoned, or we can save this many people from embarking upon, if we legalize this, then they'll refrain from illegal behaviors. Or we could say that this has a net good in the context of this, but does it also create negative societal externalities, and do those outweigh those initial benefits? And this is the way we look at it. But when we look at it this way and we think like an economist or a finance professional, these questions become they almost always become less human and much more abstract. They become the only way to make sense of a great deal of information in a lot of senses is for us to look at a question like this and say, well, I will use this in terms of numbers, or I'll convert them. Most frequently in finance, we would argue, we would do a cost benefit analysis in financial terms. We would use dollars as a means of our own sovereignty to describe a situation that is ultimately much more complex than that. And this is a fascinating dialogue that everyone has. And obviously it extends to other states like Oregon and other places that have gone farther than New Mexico in different levels of legalization. But also states that are refrained from any consideration of these effects.
Awesome. I can totally see how this card relates to the topic of the legalization of cannabis, particularly in a state where crime rates are disproportionately high and especially the way that federal governance and law enforcement actually has been problematic within certain parts of the state, particularly in rural parts of the state, and given kind of the complicated nature of being a very frontier geography, there's all sorts of complicated social and political issues in addition to the financial implications. If you were doing this discussion in the classroom, the most simple way to do this kind of discussion, let's just use the legalization of cannabis as the topic, would be roundtable mode. Just as Reilly described the topic most eloquently, you can then go around and ask students to pick a card, and then they can share their perspective on the topic itself. I'm going to go with card number 27. And card 27, I'll scroll on the screen so everybody has access to the image itself. But card 27 is the Revenant card. And the reason I like the Revenant card is it really talks a little bit about the theme on the bottom: decay, ugliness, and contempt. I think that when we think about our willingness to turn cannabis into a viable commercial market, and when we think about just even weed generally, I think there has been a long stigmatization of weed and weed users in the context that it's seen and turned into a class issue, and it becomes something where there are sophisticated drugs like cocaine, then there's the crack, which is the ghetto drug, but weed is it's the sticky icky, it's the dirty drug. And in a weird way, I've noticed that this card actually reminds me that as we're starting to commercialize something like weed, I don't know if it's going to evolve like the legalization of alcohol, because it's often seen as a very much tied to specific groups of people. It's sometimes tied to race. It's sometimes tied to class issues. And it's more often than not tied to this kind of trope of like the lazy person. But the whole thing that the legalization of cannabis also reminds me of is how we try to sanitize things in society. And the revenant card is really about ugliness. Like, why is it that we feel obsessed with trying to clean up things that we think are dirty or ugly in society? And I think the criminalization of weed before we legalized cannabis in New Mexico actually was very much connected to the way that we saw weed as a dirty or ugly thing. And it actually exacerbated the contempt for people who used weed. And I think that then became valorized. Just like I say in the card, there have been ways in which dirtiness has been turned into a thing that is celebrated. Like in the 19th century, the cult of the ugly emerged to challenge notions of purity and power. But the one that I like to think about is punk rock. Like punk rock became a way of celebrating dirtiness, right? Like I am filthy and I don't care, and I'm gonna just kind of, fling my filth at you because I think that that's my way of kind of challenging society. And weed got celebrated as part of it was a symbol of resistance during the civil rights era. It was a symbol of celebration even in gangster rap of the 1990s. You saw, especially with groups like Cypress Hill, you saw a lot of different ways in which it was valorized and it was turned into a valuable thing. And I think a lot of that actually turned into what became the commercial viability. I don't think that people in good conscience wanted to turn cannabis, legalize it because it was the right thing to do or because people were disproportionately being put in jail for it. I think it was the valorization of the ugliness of weed, in a way that actually turned it into a commercially viable thing that then changed policy.
See, this is fascinating. I agree. I want to echo your point there, especially that ultimately change is possible in policy only when it becomes a commercially viable change. And to have that commercially viable change, they needed that process of valorization, to your point, to give it to that level. And that is a fascinating cycle of approach that is, again, a way that intuitively, as a finance professor, I would not immediately be drawn to as a solution, but it makes perfect economic sense. I agree with you.
Awesome. So now if we were doing that, let's just assume that you and I were 4 students in the classroom.
Yeah.
Now Reilly part 2 or Kylie White will then it would be Kylie's turn and Kylie would then pick a card. What would be your next card in this sequence of the discussion?
Oh, this is a great question. So I'm going to pick, and especially because as this conversation has evolved, my opinion has changed somewhat. And this is really interesting. And I actually I want to Kylie White. And speaking for Kylie White, hey, I would like I'm going to use the Parliament of Trees card, card 18 in the deck. And I know you're like, how is this, and I love this discussion because it's going to launch into the questions that exist in my perspective. What struck me as a next logical point in this is the question of rural cosmopolitanism and the question of urban versus rural values in the respect of how it has shaped policy within the cannabis front, right? You have this sense of things, right? And we think about and I would counter this. So let's start on the topic of valorization and look at how it's been discussed in certain cultures and certain cycles. It's a phenomenon often of urbanization in urban spaces. And so I would say, is the legalization then of cannabis, or positing that a triumph of urban versus rural? Is it a way that urban dynamics have been utilized? Obviously, in urban situations, the urban situations are often more diverse. They involve more input from many different individuals, and then you have also a greater sense of commercialization and viability that lie within that space. And so the ingredients that exist to create and foster that change, is it unique in an urban environment, and could it also be structured this way in a rural environment as well, where arguably arguably and demographically greater opposition to legalization existed? And I'm very curious about those dynamics, particularly as it relates to this question.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great point, and I really love that you use this card, because this card really is driven off of the idea that the rural can be a shaper of the world, and it often doesn't get associated with such, right? We think of all these dense areas in urban landscapes as being the place where the world is made, and even though in urban areas that will be the place where the cannabis dispensary is going to become popularized, the reality is that rural agricultural spaces are where the weed is going to be grown in the
Mm.
first place.
Aha.
And so like there is already this very hidden and even further um diminished role that the rural plays in the development of a product that is by and large developed in a rural landscape. And so it's really interesting to see how that plays out, because especially in a place like New Mexico, where there are these, massive rural landscapes and these rural areas that are very isolated, it actually reinforces the political and economic ways in which we see the viability of weed as a product. But it also has a very real uh, social dimension to it. So I love this card. It's one of my favorite cards because of this idea that we have to challenge the way that the urban and the cosmopolitan have been linked to each other. And if there's ever going to be a way in which the rural actually changes for good, it's actually the same way in which people who used weed when it was illegal were stigmatized and disproportionately criminalized. I think people from rural areas, it gets even further, and I get really passionate coming from a rural area, being seen as quaint or as the country bumpkin, because I just don't know better than somebody who lives in London, Paris, New York, or any of these other large metropoles. So I love this card. If I am now not Manuel Montoya, but Samuel Montoya,
Samuel.
uh, I would Samuel Montoya will probably then go to
Lesser known Hobbit figure, Samuel Montoya.
it's a good Hobbit figure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna go to the Black Swan, and uh, and and one of the
Okay.
reasons I like the Black Swan card is it deals with mass production. And here's a thing I've been thinking about, um, even just as this small conversation has had. And just as a reminder, Reilly and I did not talk about this topic in advance. We
None.
just picked the topic cold. And so the cards really do lead you down a road very quickly and very effectively if you let them lead you down that road. But when I look at the Black Swan card and I think about aura and unpredictability, I think one of the things that's really cool about this card is it really emphasizes the idea that some objects are more special than others. When something is produced uniquely, like a one-off piece of art, it's special, but if you make a million of them, it's less special. And this is something that philosophers call aura. But I'm using this card to think about the way that aura exists in cannabis, because in the cannabis trade, you're going to see now all of these rare strains that have occurred from really what is artisanal or craft production of weed. I mean, it's no different from craft breweries, right? Like if you have a particular kind of hops that is created and grown in special circumstances, or special alcohols that have been distilled for 20, 30 years or something like that, we're now seeing the very beginnings of creating and associating the uniqueness and craft of producing cannabis, which probably has existed for a long time. It's just nobody wanted to talk about it because you didn't want to be legally culpable for it. But I think that now, Willie Nelson has his own strain of weed. He's branded several versions of weed, and he's done so for a while. But there is going to be this kind of emphasis now on unique strains, unique smells and flavors that are going to emanate from this. And this is going to actually become a very big part of the commercial viability of weed.
Mm. I have to say, in reacting to this, I agree with you on this too. It's fascinating, actually, and this is more of a consumer preference question: how our consumer preferences have shifted, really, We've gone from sort of a mass marketed approach to all things 50 years ago. These are the movies we watch. If you look at, say, the ratings on popular television shows we had in the 70s, it's unthinkable that any show would ever get a 40% or 40% rating or a 30% rating on any given night, even if it was wildly popular. You've seen the tendency of the last 20 years has been differentiation, differentiation, differentiation. And even and also in that respect too, is think about the commonality that we share. So I would say that it's become very difficult to relate to people around certain popular culture phenomena because our popular culture phenomena has themselves have become so nuanced. And so your popular show, which is open to say online, it might be via a streaming service, has 1 million viewers or something, or half million viewers, successful in its own regard, is still viewed by such a small percentage of people as being their source and their optimal choice. And then reviewing this back into the cannabis market, we have this differentiation occurring at this moment. And I also have to say, I have to remark that I'm also very appreciative that in addition to aura, the other solution is unpredictability. As this evolution of the cannabis market unfolds, and then you have not only the Willie Nelson thing and this greater differentiation, is this pathway one of absolute differentiation over the next 50 years? Will the cycle return to greater homogenization? What will be the result of this? And especially as it affects all things. And I'm interested in how that would be approached. And that's amazing.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, what's going to become quote unquote the king of beers, the king of weed,
yeah,
versus the the one-off that's made artisanally in somebody's handmade garage or production facility. There's going to be so much variety of that, and they're going to all determine different rituals and traditions that make the consumption of cannabis very, very, very different and very, very I hate to say it because of hemp, but because I'm trying to avoid puns, I'm trying, but it's going to be woven into the fabric of society with hemp. And I just had to do it. And now I apologize to everybody who had to bear that. So, but we can take this card again. We've gone through 4 cards, and basically everyone in a classroom could go around and share their perspective. And what's really neat about this process is that it doesn't turn adversarial. Like, you don't have to get into a debate. You can moderate it in such a way that everybody just says their piece. And I actually learned a great deal by working with the students from Japan, where the discussion actually very naturally went into just sharing your perspective. You didn't have to get into a debate with somebody to turn it into a discussion. And I think that's what was resonated in the room on Tuesday when we did this, when we did a Terra Prime session, is that in the classroom, particularly in the United States, I think students make the assumption that they have to be in there to show off what they know or to win a conversation. And it's actually more important to win the conversation or to disagree with somebody, especially in these polemical times. I think that we're reinforced. We're constantly challenged or drawn to disagree with people. And this card can actually break that. This deck, you can use it just to hear somebody's perspective. And in fact, by using the cards, you're not relying on these kind of old dogmatic ways in which we train ourselves to think from our quote unquote position. We can just kind of break and think kind of a little bit more freely and creatively about what we're doing. So that's roundtable mode. And I know that that's a really good way. But another way that you can use it in the class is challenge mode.
Ooh.
Now, roundtable is very nice because everybody gets a say and it democratizes the amount of time that people have in the room with an idea or a topic. But you can also do it a couple ways. You can have people challenge one another, designated that way, or you can have the students, rather than do question and answer, you can have the students challenge you as the professor. And this can actually happen at the dinner table as well. If somebody's designated as the person who's kind of facilitating a discussion, you can just challenge them. And so now I'm going to ask Miley White, like,
How about
Miley, I'm gonna challenge Miley White. Miley, I'm gonna challenge you to think about cannabis using.
Ooh. Okay.
Wow, I'm gonna use a really difficult one because I have a lot of faith in you, Miley. The Leviathan.
Ah, the Leviathan card. I knew that would be on the deck somewhere today.
That's it's a beautiful
Oh,
card. I love William Blake, and I love the way that that this card plays out. Just as a side note, one of the conversations about culture shock in Japan amongst the Japanese students was that the top part of the card reminded them of Japan, the bottom part reminded them of America. And that was their contribution to culture shock, which was, I thought, just using the image itself was extremely fraught
wow.
and powerful. So that was very cool. But now I've wasted a little bit of time so that you could you could think through the Leviathan card. How does card 8 relate to the topic at hand? Let's go to the prompt here.
Okay. Yes. All right. So in this prompt, so Thomas Hobbes suggests that the Leviathan had such greatness that it made all seafarers feel small in its presence. The awe and wonder it inspired is what he argues is the foundation of sovereignty, the ability for a group to make decisions on its own behalf. How have you heard groups of people defend their right to self-determination, and what makes us willing to die or kill for certain groups we belong to? Okay, so let's bring this card in. Let's bring the cannabis legalization front into the Leviathan. So it almost covered. It's something that has existed. You know, if we look at this, the scope of cannabis consumption, something that's followed a lot of human history. We know Central Asia. We know, we have evidence that Scythians, other ancient Central Asian tribes existed and used cannabis for religious or medicinal purposes. We know that it has been something that has spread in consumption from old world to new in the last 500 years, and also it's something that remains, I would argue, up until the last interest in providing it a voice, sort of an unspoken Leviathan, a true Leviathan that lives beneath the waves of popular discourse, right? So back in the 90s, it's within all of our memories to go back 15 years and realize that cannabis consumption itself was something that was something everyone understood, was a thing that was part coming of age. It's a thing where you can ascribe certain things to. We saw in spoken more boldly and valorized, to use your language, Manuel, in different cultural communities rather than others. But among the broader scope of public policy, it remained an unspoken Leviathan, or at least one that was spoken of ill. And I would say that that remained this mysterious, like the Leviathan. That lack of knowledge becomes in itself a thing to fear, I would argue. Something that lurks beneath the waves of popular public discourse, an evil that's out to get children and adults and those things. And you had that idea, you've had that since the sort of the dangers of reefer mentality of the 1930s.
Reefer Madness, yeah.
Reefer madness. And so you had this sort of sense. And so it seemed, maybe is it, and so in looking at this from a fear point, it seemed greater and more nefarious than it actually turned out to be. When you name something and you grapple with the creature head on, does it become less threatening? I would then argue. And sort of in public discourse, I think merely possessing the discourse, which has already been discussed and utilized, valorized, been part of so many cultural communities, but not evidenced in public policy in a constructive way, apart from its legalization and forbiddenness. I would say that it has made it less threatening to people. I'd say it's also taken, if I take the Leviathan card, I would say that we've muted its when we remove the mystery or the veil of something, we become the Leviathan is something less interesting. And I love the picture too. And when you speak to the picture of this, you almost see, I see cannabis here as that unspoken dragon, and beneath the hands of the righteous and cultured civilians that are keeping down. We're not gonna talk about this. This is something that exists below our phase of our visage, our common views, and it remains in a space that we don't really engage. And then now we engage it, and so we ask it this: is it still a dragon? Have we still adequately described it as something that's ill? Is it something else than that? Or is it something that is neither dragon nor something else, but something that is worthy of description only in the sense that it provides an important, many people, and kind of stepping on the stones, not trying to vilify it or create an aura of excellence around it. Is it not that we perhaps focus too much on creating binary buckets for policy issues, when in fact this represents something that we can grapple with intellectually now as
Yeah.
people. And I would say that as cannabis then through its legalization, it becomes something where we understand it more, and it would evolve from a leviathan. But then the question of sovereignty and self-determination, what brought it about? It was in additional, and I would say that a large part of it was not only the commercialization of that. I think valorization was a way to express sovereignty, and I would say that valorization is a way to express self-determination. You're telling me this is illegal, but why is it illegal? And when something does not appear to be illogical, it rests on the individual to speak up against it and try to say, wait a second, prove this to me why this is demonized this way. Prove to me that the Leviathan is itself a danger. You're standing against, it's like the village, and you're standing against a mythological a creature that's out to get you, and you stand against the side of the forest and say, this is behind us and it will kill you. But will it really? And you have to sit and pause in that acceptance of, or that knowledge of it as potentially not being as deadly, I would argue is an affirmation of self-determination.
Awesome. Yeah, I was thinking about a similar thing, just given like the rituals behind it. 420 is a holiday now. It's a
Yeah,
thing. Like you
it's
have
a thing. It's a
420.
thing.
Yeah, the cannabis leaf is symbolic, right? People wear it as jewelry. It's iconic. But also like the way in which like communities have celebrated it under the veneer, right? It has been. It's the dragon beneath the layer of morality. The hierarchy in this card is really, really dramatic here. But I also thought that um, as a state, the state of New Mexico has somehow become comfortable with those rituals and those symbols that have made the community of cannabis growing and consuming uh, viable. Oregon has done it. There's several other places that have done it, but the federal government as a sovereign still has not. And so you're going to see this interplay now of really it's actually now a politics of representation. It's a politics of which signs and symbols actually will be able to adequately represent the larger population, because the weed symbol is not going to be accepted the same way in another part of the country or even another part of the world as it is. And even in New Mexico, there are going to be different laws, like Pueblo law is going to allow for different forms of regulation of cannabis and even export that is going to be highly interesting over the next few years, up until the point where the federal government can or will legalize it as well. So that's a good question. So my challenge to you now is to challenge me.
Yeah.
So you pick a card and I have to say something.
Oh, great. I can't wait. I have two in mind. So I challenge you. So looking at this as a next angle of looking at the question of sovereignty and self-determination, I also want to consider card 19, indigeneity and origin, or the Pangea card. And the Pangea card is always something in the art speaks to this, a prehistoric supercontinent, but also something that exists in a very practical application to modern days.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just read a little bit of a prompt here so that I can get my brain going with it. Pangea is the name given to a prehistoric supercontinent that connected much of the world's land masses. It's also become a way to describe something that existed before humans associated their origins to a specific place. And for this reason, it has a romantic quality. It connects all people's origins to the same place. Indigeneity refers to the quality of belonging to a group of people who are native to a place before it was colonized by another group of people. Now, one of the things that I think about when cannabis, if I were to associate cannabis with this card, my mind goes first to the way that almost kind of an organic connection to nature is established when you think about weed, that or cannabis. It's very similar to the way that people make an association between certain communities and the use of um, special species of plants like peyote, right? Like you think like there is kind of this the idea there's a stigma, there's the stigma of getting high and in kind of these very reefer madness kind of ways. But then there's also this association with kind of getting back to like the roots of what nature provides you. And this actually becomes part of like even kind of hippie culture, right? So you kind of see that in the 1960s. There's kind of this intersection between hippie culture and kind of indigeneity in this very interesting, maybe even appropriative way, but still there's this kind of association with like you're getting back to nature when you're weed and shrooms and peyote, they have a special quality because they're kind of from the ground up, and then they become a very interesting doorway for people to kind of celebrate a connection to land and to kind of things that have existed, old things. Like smoking weed in a lot of ways has a very it's not just medicinal, it's ritualistically spiritual, and it has that kind of element to it in a way that sometimes tacks on to claiming some sort of origin before people started to claim themselves as nationalistic or whatever else they belong to. So there is kind of this deep connection between smoking in different cultures of the world to being kind of or in the original world, like the spirit world, but also to like a world that existed before civilization kind of took over. And that can be positive and negative, right? It can be a power term where you're kind of appropriating and maybe even being kind of ignorant of certain values within certain communities. But it is also, I think, largely it can become popularized as a way of connecting to the origins, to our human origins, where we were, you know, when we first connected to plants and we learned a connection to the planet in a way that that superseded civilization.
That's fantastic. I agree. I love those points that you first mentioned, and particularly involving sort of that connection, and also how it differentiates from sort of the man-made drugs or man-made
Right.
attempts at this, and to create a differentiation there, and maybe perhaps because of that organic nature of this, perhaps more intuitively, we're more comfortable discussing that legalization in this current stage in our society than perhaps some other institutional or some other drugs that have been around for a long time, like LSD or something else that have a much more inorganic perspective. We have a comfort with that discussion, which is very interesting. Fascinating. I love it.
Yeah. So basically you can do challenge mode if you wanted to change it up a little bit within the roundtable mode. And then the last version is random mode, where you can just pick a card and you know, I've used a random number generator. You can find one online. You can do it any number of ways. You can draw cards or whatever. You can draw numbers. But basically at that point, then we could just randomly select. And I'm using a random number generator right here. It's going to be on my phone. And I picked out of 28 and I click go here. And the number that is given to me is 3. So the number that popped up is the Legion card. And so then we kind of can use this as the topic of discussion. So you and I can both go. What does the Legion card say about the topic we're using?
Ooh, so this is good. I love your random number generator approach. This was good. There was so this is good because you think about crowds and power, and I would say that, you know, as the card relates, and it says so on sort of the next page, it's often a function of populism. And populism is something right now, when you think of populism in its root in the people, is an important dialogue to have. And look at the representation of sort of the evolution of this for good and for bad in the last 30 years, right? So, or in the last 50 years, and even in that, arguably in that sense, we know populism, of course, in aggregate has come and gone with different waves of human history. But you enter into a mode that is often the approach to sort of cannabis in that respect, traditionally very dominated from a sort of a patrician class, dominated from a very high level that is prescribing something to other people. This is bad. I know better. And so therefore you should apply it. And I would argue that the collective cultural valorization, the utilization of cannabis, the understanding of cannabis, since the 60s in particular, has been a galvanizing point for many people who have said, wait a second, my personal experience with this is at odds with the official experience. Together and in mass, there has been a great interest. And this is what's interesting about this, is it's not something that spawns itself protest, right? It's not something where a million people marched on Washington to legalize cannabis. This is something that happened it was still very populistic, I would argue. But it was also a populism that resulted from a general understanding of a thing, as opposed to a populism that revolved from popular movement. And so I would say, in this, as this relates, I would say the legalization of cannabis is directly related to this legion card. And legions don't have to be obvious things. They don't have to be, the Roman army out there looking at you, but they can also be embedded within the way that our own minds work, shape, and are influenced by day-to-day interactions with the people that we know. And that collective transformation of a culture from one area to the next culture was very popularistic, but it was also very slow. It was very deliberate, and it was very intentional over time. And this is still continued even post legalization. If we follow the demographic trends of the adults in favor of legalization, it seems to suggest that this has become a very popular viewpoint and a popular phenomenon, at least from a majority of Americans at this level. And it's fascinating because we know populism has two sides to this. This is an instance of populism saying, okay, let's examine this and create progress in a way that matches sort of expectations and our understanding of reality. And then there are other forms of populism which can be driven by other emotions, and emotions such as anger or vengefulness or revanchism or something else that you have in this approach that can create more toxic levels of populism. And I would argue that this was that this was created for different reasons. But I'm interested in this because populism is often a wide brush, but it has many manifestations.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think, there's two terms that are playing with each other here, right? To be
Right.
popular and then populism. And what
Ah,
happens when a thing becomes popular? And I think about Snoop Dogg, I think about Willie Nelson, I think about Cypress Hill, I think about certain people that kind of have, when it was quote unquote underground, and really kind of underground culture, like was
right.
promoting, to your point, I think it was a populist movement that was happening because the underground was kind of swelling as a populist movement, and it was actually kind of trying to critique elitism and all these other things. Willie Nelson's a folk hero, so basically it is like this idea, and even Snoop Dogg, you could argue, was a folk hero at a certain level. And a lot of people who have become symbolic of supporting weed have really kind of derived as folk heroes that have kind of challenged whether or not the elites of the world have all the power, and so this is an uprising of quote unquote the people. The thing that I'm interested in is what's going to happen when this becomes, and this is one of my favorite questions on the card. It's the last question in the question section. It says, what's the difference between a theme and a theme park? And so what's going to happen when cannabis turns into the theme park? Because now as it becomes popularized, and I know I'm not going to name anybody, but I know people who have partaken even when it wasn't legal, and there's some concerns around people saying, well, I actually liked it when it was underground. I liked it when there was kind of a seductive quality to like it was cool, but now it's not going to be cool because the way that it's become popular, it's going to ruin everything. It's going to ruin the specialness of it, and it's also then going to kind of diminish the reason that I liked it so much. I feel like I know whatever, right? I know 50 varieties of weed, and I'm an expert. But now, some jerk who's never even heard of weed, or never heard of kind of these kind of subcultures when I used to read High Times or something like that. Like now it's just somebody wearing the t-shirt, and it's somebody that now I feel like I'm now in a community with people that I don't really feel connected to. And that's a part of the popularity I'm going to see is interesting in the way that it influences people who kind of feel an emotional attachment to it when it was rare and even illegal.
I love that point, and especially as we evolve beyond the populism, and that point of also using it as a cultural connection or an artifact of cultural connection with people to whom that you share an affinity or share cultural values, and now it's suddenly become it's passe. It's not edgy. it becomes
Right.
something that is a bit more a bit more. In that sense, we've seen sort of it evolve to something that becomes popular, can be sort of a root of its own lack of success. And I know that, obviously we saw, for so many years, we saw the beer industry, for instance, be something that was very homogenized between one or two or three brands in the United States, and that's a relic of prohibition. And then we saw an explosion of different companies that created beers and sort of the craft beer movement. But then since that time, we've also seen aggregate alcohol consumption among especially younger age groups decline. And is that because the populism, the popularity, is it cashed out? Will it remain? Will popular does something that is popular, does that create or sow the seeds of its own downfall in the future, or at least perhaps it will evolve again into something that is much more niche as people use it, they turn away from it, they find something else, and then wait a second, it's rediscovered by a future generation at some later date. It's fascinating. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I don't know. I know some people who are going to be a little concerned when Buffy the soccer mom is going
Yeah.
with all her friends to go to a cannabis dispensary after they pick up the kids or something like that. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's gonna be something that people are going to be thinking about. And yeah, I don't know. Will it undo its own self, the reason that it became popular in the first place?
I agree. That's amazing.
Well, so those are three ways in which you can use it, either in the classroom or just even in a regular conversation like Reilly and I have been doing. There are other ways that are a little bit more complicated. You'll notice on each of the cards, there are these depart, clarification, reflect, and affirm. And on the other side of the card, veils and activator. Now, the handbook describes these in greater detail. There's a whole section where you can go a little bit deeper with the cards. But what this is intended to do is if you want your students to interact with each other, rather than just kind of focusing on the cards, because the cards can isolate the student as much as anything else. But these prompts are intended to then kind of push the students, or to push people who are having conversations with each other, to then kind of work through, like, you made an interesting point about populism. I can turn the card over and I can basically say, I like what you said, but I want to depart, or I want clarification on what was said. And so you can put the card down on the table with the depart clarification, basically this part here. You can have it basically facing the person, and then you can start interacting with people. And this is a way to actually then get into a discussion again in a framed way, because a lot of people, and I've had students who don't feel comfortable having conversations with other people that they think are already going to kind of nail them with a fine point, or kind of debate them into embarrassment or something like that. And so these prompts are actually ways in which students can feel comfortable engaging with people, and maybe even challenging things that were said without it being adversarial. And I thought that was a really nice element to it. Like, for example, if people are having a discussion that seems maybe like they're like the interpretation of the card or the topic is going in entirely different directions, that's totally cool. But you can also just kind of leave it as such as saying, I'm going to turn this card over and have the veils prompt facing you, so that we can just say, let's just leave it as ambiguous. And I want to move on to another thing, because it's an exciting topic, and we're just going to leave this kind of right here. Not a agree to disagree sort of thing, but just let's just leave it ambiguous for now and move on to something else. In the future, we're going to be developing other materials, including a physical journal that actually has, and it's ruled in such a way where then we went through 7 cards today in our conversation. And so basically what we can do is we can take notes. Reilly said this, Kylie said this, Miley said this, they drew this card, and here's maybe a 1 or 2 liner of what was said. And this is really cool for dinner parties, or even for going out to the movies or something. You can talk about, like, I saw the movie Dune, and I want to talk about the movie Dune. This is a way for us to kind of talk about it, but you can memorialize your conversations. And that's the thing. We're going to develop an app, and we're also going to develop journals that are going to allow you to then kind of take pictures of things, and it'll then allow you to then record how the conversation went, so that you can go back a year from now and say, remember that conversation Reilly and I had about the legalization of weed? And without the benefit of a video, you can still go back to it and say, wow, that's where we were in our lives. this is what we chose to talk about. And that conversation probably is going to be entirely different from Reilly in the future and Manuel as I become the T1000. And now I have to now I have to go back in time to undo myself because I made all sorts of messes. But I want to take a moment just to thank you, Reilly. This was thanks for giving up your time, but also giving up your energy and your vulnerability, because doing these sorts of things is it's a courageous thing as well to have conversations with people. And that's one of the things that I want for Terra Prime. I want people to be more courageous and brave in the way that they engage with thinking in the world. And so, Reilly, you're one of my favorite thinkers and one of my favorite colleagues. So thanks for joining me today. And please always don't hesitate to call on me or any member of the Terra Prime family if you want additional support for what you do and how you use the cards.
Thank you so much, Manuel. It's a great honor, and the feeling is more than mutual. You're amazing. And for the last 13 years I've been teaching, it has been something where I've been searching for a way to address topics that students have in a reasonable level of debate and to allow students to learn and engage each other in an affirming way. And this deck, and I'm not paid at all to do this, but this deck has enabled this. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk about it and work with it with you today. This has been awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being an advocate. And on our slide here, I'm just asking everybody respectfully, please visit our website and our store, tell people about it. We're going to be sponsoring schools to have these conversations. And I'm just excited about where this is going to go. So visit terraprime.com and support us any way you can. This is just the beginning. Thanks a lot, Reilly. Have a great day.
Thank you, Manuel.